The engine's roar shattered Dawn's silence, making me drop my coffee mug. Two uniformed men, wearing hard hats, emerged from a massive truck. My heart pounded as I realized they were heading toward the backup generator system I'd meticulously installed in my backyard. Standing at a distance, with a smug smile, was Karen, the HOA president. They began dismantling my property, but Karen had no idea she'd just ignited a war that I, a seasoned engineer, would never lose. "Stop!" I shouted, rushing outside. Karen waved a document. "Violation notice, Mr. Han." Her eyes gleamed with triumph. But she didn't know she wasn't just destroying my generator, she was destroying her own HOA. Lucas Han wiped the sweat from his brow as he stared at the remnants of his generator system. 6 months of planning and $30,000 gone in minutes. The two workers had already loaded most of the components onto their truck, leaving behind only disconnected wires and mounting brackets. "This is completely illegal," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "I have all the permits from the city. You can't just come onto my property." And Article 7, Section 12 of the Westwood Springs. "HOA covenant," Karen interrupted, tapping her manicured nail against the document. "No external installations that detract from neighborhood aesthetics." The board voted unanimously last night. Lucas had moved to Westwood Springs just 3 months ago, after 15 years designing power systems for everything from hospitals to military bases. He'd wanted somewhere peaceful. The neighborhood had seemed perfect, quiet streets, good schools nearby for when he eventually started a family, and, most importantly, space for his home engineering projects. "I reviewed those covenants before purchasing this house," Lucas replied, pulling out his phone. "There's nothing prohibiting backup power systems, and I have city permits." Karen's smile tightened. "The board has discretion over aesthetic matters. Your contraption is an eyesore." The contraption was actually a state-of-the-art hybrid system, a fuel generator integrated with solar panels and battery storage. It could power his entire house for weeks during outages, something increasingly common with the region's aging power grid. "I can install privacy screens," Lucas offered, trying to remain reasonable, "or landscaping to hide it from view." "The decision is final," Karen said, turning to leave. "Remove any remaining components by Friday, or face additional fines." As her SUV pulled away, Lucas noticed his neighbor, Tom, watching from across the street. The elderly man approached slowly, leaning on his cane. "Sorry about your generator," Tom said. "Karen's been on a power trip since becoming president last year. Is she always like this?" Lucas asked. Tom nodded grimly. "Used to be a reasonable place to live. Now she finds violations where none exist. Fined the Johnsons for their basketball hoop. Made the Patels remove their vegetable garden. Claims it's about property values, but what? Her husband's in real estate. Funny how houses keep going on the market after people get tired of fighting her." Over the next week, Lucas tried every reasonable approach. He attended the HOA meeting, presented architectural plans for screening the system, and even offered to paint it to match the house. Karen rejected every proposal, citing vague community standards, while other board members nodded in silent agreement. Then the fines started $200 daily for continued violation. When Lucas refused to pay, a lien notice arrived threatening foreclosure proceedings. Lucas was reviewing the notice when his power went out. Not just his house, the entire neighborhood. He smiled grimly as his lights flickered back on automatically while the street remained dark. His partially dismantled system still functioned enough to power essential circuits. His doorbell rang 30 minutes later. Karen stood there, illuminated by his porch light. "Your power's still on," she said accusingly. "Emergency backup," Lucas replied. "Just enough for basics. Turn it off. It's not fair to others." Lucas stared at her incredulously. "You had my main system removed. This is all that's left. Either turn it off or share it," she demanded. "Share it? Yesterday you called it an eyesore and a violation." Karen's expression hardened. "The HOA can invoke emergency powers during outages. Your system needs to benefit everyone or be shut down." As she walked away, Lucas noticed something odd while the neighborhood was dark. One house at the end of the street had lights on. Karen's house. The next morning, Lucas began investigating. City records showed Karen had opposed municipal backup generator installations last year, claiming they were unnecessary. Yet her own home never seemed affected by outages. Lucas discovered a pattern. Karen had systematically blocked all individual and community resilience measures while quietly ensuring her own home remained powered during outages. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control and possibly something more sinister. "Two can play this game," Lucas muttered, pulling out his engineering notebooks. If Karen wanted a war, she'd picked the wrong engineer to battle. The morning after discovering Karen's home was mysteriously powered during the outage, Lucas awoke to the sound of heavy machinery. He rushed to his window, coffee mug still in hand, and froze at the sight below. A large truck with Valley Demolition Services emblazoned on its side had parked in front of his house. 4 men in hard hats were unloading equipment, while Karen directed them with animated gestures. Lucas bolted downstairs and burst through his front door. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the manicured lawns. Karen turned, her smile cold and practiced. "Good morning, Mr. Hahn. As per our discussion yesterday, we're removing the remainder of your non-compliant installation." "You have absolutely no right," Lucas said, stepping between the workers and his property. "This is illegal entry and destruction of private property." Karen sighed theatrically and pulled a document from her designer handbag. "Actually, I do. The board approved Emergency Regulation 17C last night. It grants the HOA authority to remove hazardous equipment during post-outage assessments." Lucas snatched the paper, scanning it quickly. The document looked official, complete with letterhead and signatures. But something felt off. The regulation cited powers that seemed impossibly broad. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't just create regulations overnight to justify trespassing. I assure you, everything is perfectly legal," Karen replied, her voice honey sweet but eyes hard as flint. "Now please step aside, or I'll be forced to call the authorities for obstruction." Lucas retreated inside, but not in surrender. He grabbed his phone and began recording through the window as the crew descended on what remained of his backup system. Each disconnected wire and removed panel was captured in high-definition video. When they began cutting through the mounting brackets with power tools, he stepped outside again, phone still recording. "I'm documenting everything," he announced loudly. Every person, every action, every piece of equipment being destroyed. Karen's smile faltered momentarily. "That's your right, of course." Lucas dialed 911, maintaining eye contact with Karen. "I need to report trespassing and destruction of property," he told the dispatcher, giving his address. "There are individuals removing equipment from my property without my consent." Karen approached, her confidence unwavering. "The police won't help you. HOAs have broad legal authority in this state." When the police arrived 15 minutes later, Karen presented her documentation with practiced ease. The officers, clearly uncomfortable with the civil dispute, suggested Lucas take the matter to court rather than pursue criminal charges. "This isn't over," Lucas told Karen as she left, supervising the truck now loaded with the last components of his system. "It actually is," she replied. "But don't worry, we're planning a neighborhood-wide generator system next year. For a modest monthly fee, of course." That evening, Lucas spread documents across his dining table. His engineering background had taught him to be methodical, to analyze systems for weaknesses. Now he was applying those same principles to Karen and the Westwood Springs HOA. He started with the HOA bylaws, highlighting inconsistencies between the original document and Karen's updated version. Next came financial statements he'd requested weeks ago, but only received after threatening legal action. The numbers didn't add up: maintenance fees collected, but services never rendered. Special assessments for projects never completed. At 11:30 p.m., his doorbell rang. Lucas opened it to find Tom, his elderly neighbor, looking nervously over his shoulder. "Sorry for the late hour," Tom whispered, "but I thought you should have this." He handed Lucas a thumb drive. "I was treasurer before Karen pushed me out. These are the financial records from the past 3 years." Lucas thanked him, and as Tom shuffled away, he plugged in the drive. What he found made his blood boil. Detailed spreadsheets showed systematic misappropriation of HOA funds, money that should have gone to community improvements, instead diverted to shell companies with vague service descriptions. The next morning, Lucas called Michelle Chen, a former colleague who now specialized in forensic accounting. "I need your professional opinion on something," he explained, sending her the files. And complete discretion, Michelle called back that afternoon. "Lucas, this is textbook embezzlement," she said. "These companies, Westwood Maintenance Solutions, Valley Landscape Innovations, they don't exist in any business registry I can access. But they've received over $300,000 from your HOA in the past 2 years. Can you trace where the money went?" Lucas asked. "Already did," Michelle replied. "The payments were routed through 3 different banks before landing in offshore accounts. But here's the interesting part. I found connections to Pinnacle Real Estate Development. Karen's husband works there," Lucas said, the pieces falling into place. "He doesn't just work there, he's a principal partner. And guess what? They've been buying properties in your neighborhood at below market rates." Over the next week, Lucas and Michelle built their case. They discovered Karen had systematically targeted homeowners with expensive harassment campaigns, forcing many to sell at losses homes that Pinnacle then acquired through seemingly unrelated shell companies. Lucas also began quietly meeting with neighbors, showing them evidence of financial misconduct. Many shared their own stories of Karen's intimidation tactics: elderly residents pressured about minor violations, families with children cited for noise disturbances, immigrants threatened with legal action over cultural decorations. The pattern was clear. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was orchestrating a sophisticated scheme to drive down property values and acquire homes cheaply for her husband's development company. On Friday evening, Lucas received an official-looking envelope. Inside was a notice of foreclosure proceedings against his home for unpaid HOA fines totaling $6,800. The document gave him 30 days to pay or vacate. Lucas smiled grimly as he added it to his evidence file. Karen had just made her biggest mistake. He picked up his phone and dialed Michelle. "It's time," he said. "Set up the meeting with the district attorney and contact that investigative reporter you mentioned, the one who specializes in real estate fraud." As he hung up, his house went dark. Another power outage. But unlike his neighbors, Lucas was prepared. He'd secretly installed a small, unobtrusive backup system in his garage. As his lights flickered back on, he looked across at Karen's house, also illuminated while the rest of the neighborhood sat in darkness. "Game on, Karen," he whispered, opening his laptop to finalize their presentation for the authorities. Game on. The week following Karen's demolition crew visit was a flurry of activity for Lucas. He converted his home office into what resembled a war room, with documents pinned to walls, financial spreadsheets spread across tables, and a detailed timeline of Karen's actions meticulously charted on a whiteboard. Each night, he worked late into the evening, fueled by determination and black coffee, assembling the pieces of what had become a complex puzzle of corruption. "This is more than just a petty HOA dispute," Michelle remarked on Thursday evening as she reviewed the latest findings. "We're looking at systematic fraud, embezzlement, and possibly racketeering." Lucas nodded grimly, sorting through a stack of printouts. "I've got statements from 15 different homeowners now. Each one describes the same pattern. Karen identifies, ovulation imposes unreasonable fines, then escalates until they're forced to sell. And conveniently, her husband's company swoops in to purchase the properties," Michelle added, tapping her pen against a spreadsheet. "Often through different shell companies to hide the connection." The final piece arrived Friday morning, an official letter from the city planning department confirming that Lucas's generator system had been fully permitted and compliant with all municipal codes. The letter explicitly stated that HOA regulations could not override city-approved installations related to essential services. "Perfect timing," Lucas said, carefully adding the document to his evidence binder. "The monthly HOA meeting is tonight." Michelle looked concerned. "Are you sure you want to confront her publicly?" She could retaliate. Lucas's expression hardened. "She's already trying to foreclose on my home. What else can she do? Besides, this isn't just about me anymore." The Westwood Springs Community Center was unusually crowded that evening. Word had spread that there would be a vote on significant new enforcement measures, and homeowners who rarely attended meetings had shown up in force, filling the rows of folding chairs. Karen stood at the podium, immaculately dressed in a navy blazer, looking every bit the confident executive. "Before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see such community engagement," she said, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We have several important items on the agenda, starting with proposed amendments to our enforcement procedures." Lucas sat quietly in the back row, his evidence binder on his lap, watching as Karen outlined a draconian new system of fines and penalties for covenant violations. The room grew increasingly tense as she detailed how the board would have expanded powers to enter properties for compliance inspections with minimal notice. And finally, Karen concluded, "We'll be implementing a streamlined foreclosure process for habitual violators to protect our community standards and property values." "I'd like to speak to that point," Lucas called out, rising from his seat. Karen's smile faltered slightly. "We'll take comments after the vote, Mr. Hahn." "Actually," Lucas replied, walking toward the front of the room, "HOA bylaws require member discussion before any vote on bylaw amendments." Section 5, Paragraph 3. A murmur rippled through the audience as Lucas reached the front, carrying his binder and a USB drive. "Since you're so concerned about rules and procedures," he continued, "I thought we might discuss some other rules that have been broken." He turned to address the audience directly. "My name is Lucas Hahn. 3 months ago, I moved into this neighborhood. 2 weeks ago, Karen ordered a crew to destroy my legally permitted backup power system." He plugged the USB drive into the laptop connected to the room's projector. The screen lit up with crystal-clear video footage showing Karen directing workers to dismantle Lucas's equipment. "This was recorded on my property," Without my consent, Lucas explained, his voice steady. When I presented my city permits, I was told they didn't matter because of HOA regulations. Karen stepped forward, her composure cracking slightly. That system violated our aesthetic guidelines. The board voted, did they? Lucas interrupted, pulling out a document. Because I have here the minutes from every board meeting for the past 6 months. There was never a vote on my property. He turned to the 4 other board members seated at the table. Did any of you vote on this specific enforcement action? The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but remained silent. Lucas continued, clicking to the next slide, a financial spreadsheet. This is the HOA's financial statement from last quarter. Notice anything strange? $45,000 for landscape maintenance yet. Our common areas haven't been serviced in months. $30,000 for security upgrades that were never installed. Karen lunged for the laptop. This is confidential information. You have no right. Actually, I do, Lucas countered, stepping between her and the computer. HOA financial records must be made available to all members upon request. Another rule you've ignored. The room had grown deathly quiet, all eyes fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. Let me show you where that money actually went, Lucas said, advancing to the next slide. These are bank records showing transfers from our HOA account to companies that don't exist, except as paper entities that funnel money to offshore accounts. Karen's face had drained of color. These are baseless accusations. I won't stand here and Pinnacle Real Estate Development, Lucas continued relentlessly. Owned by James Wilson, your husband, the company that has mysteriously acquired 7 properties in this neighborhood in the past year, all from homeowners who faced aggressive HOA enforcement actions. An elderly woman in the front row stood up shakily. They forced me to remove my wheelchair ramp, claiming it violated architectural standards. Then fined me $200 a day until I had to sell. Her statement broke the dam. Suddenly, residents were standing, sharing their stories. A family forced to remove solar panels, another pressured to sell after being fined for their child's treehouse. An immigrant couple harassed about cultural decorations during holidays. The community center doors swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers entered, accompanied by a man in a suit. Karen Wilson? The suited man asked, approaching the podium. I'm Detective Ramirez with the Financial Crimes Unit. We'd like to ask you some questions regarding allegations of embezzlement and fraudulent financial activities. Karen's composure finally shattered. This is ridiculous. You can't just barge in here based on the wild accusations of, we have a warrant, Detective Ramirez interrupted, holding up a document based on evidence submitted to our department and the district attorney's office earlier this week. As the officers escorted a protesting Karen from the room, the remaining board members sat in stunned silence. The residents began talking all at once, a mixture of shock, anger, and relief filling the room. Tom, Lucas's elderly neighbor, made his way to the front. I move that we immediately suspend all current enforcement actions pending a complete audit of HOA activities, he announced in a surprisingly strong voice. The motion passed unanimously. Outside, as Karen was being placed in a police cruiser, Lucas watched from the community center steps. She caught his eye just before ducking into the vehicle, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. This isn't over, she mouthed silently. Lucas simply nodded. He knew battles like this were rarely won in a single engagement, but for tonight at least, the neighborhood could breathe a little easier. The following months brought a whirlwind of legal proceedings that captivated the Westwood Springs community. Karen's trial became the talk of the neighborhood, with residents filling the courthouse benches each day, watching as the prosecution methodically presented evidence of her elaborate scheme. The financial trail that Michelle had uncovered proved devastating, revealing how Karen had diverted over $450 of HOA funds during her 4-year tenure as president. The defendant exploited her position of trust to enrich herself at the expense of her neighbors. The prosecutor declared during closing arguments, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. She weaponized community regulations to force vulnerable homeowners into financial distress, then profited from their misfortune. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Karen was found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, criminal conspiracy, and malicious destruction of property. The judge, clearly disturbed by the evidence, sentenced her to 5 years in prison and ordered full restitution to the HOA and affected homeowners. "Your actions represent an extraordinary breach of trust," the judge stated, peering sternly over his glasses at Karen, who stood rigid and expressionless before him. "You turned what should have been a community organization into your personal enforcement mechanism for profit." The financial fallout was immediate and severe. The HOA's insurance covered some losses, but the organization teetered on the brink of insolvency. An emergency meeting was called, where residents voted unanimously to dissolve the current board and establish new leadership with strict oversight measures. Lucas, despite numerous nominations, declined a position on the new board. "I'm better at solving problems than running meetings," he explained with a smile. Instead, he focused his energy on rebuilding his generator system, this time with the enthusiastic support of his neighbors. On a crisp Saturday morning, 3 months after Karen's conviction, a small crowd gathered in Lucas's backyard. They watched with interest as he connected the final components of his new, improved power system, one that could now provide emergency backup to several neighboring homes as well. "Is that the same system she had destroyed?" asked Maria, a young mother from across the street. Lucas shook his head, running his hand along the sleek solar panels. "No, this is much better. Sometimes when things get broken, we rebuild them stronger." Tom, now serving as the HOA's new treasurer, approached with a document in hand. "The restitution checks came through yesterday," he said, handing Lucas an envelope. "This covers the full value of your destroyed equipment, plus damages." Lucas accepted it with a nod. "What about the others?" "Everyone's being made whole," Tom assured him. "And Karen's husband's company is being forced to offer the properties back to the original owners at their sale prices." As the gathering dispersed, Lucas remained in his yard, making final adjustments to his system. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house, the last of her possessions being removed as the property went up for sale. Later that evening, as Lucas sat on his porch watching the sunset, the neighborhood experienced another power outage, the third that month, due to aging infrastructure. While other homes went dark, soft lights glowed from Lucas's windows and gradually spread to the houses connected to his backup system. He smiled quietly to himself, sipping his tea in the gathering darkness. Sometimes, standing your ground wasn't just about winning, it was about illuminating a better way forward. Have you ever faced a power-hungry neighbor like Karen? This story may seem extreme, but HOA conflicts happen every day across America. The delicate balance between community standards and personal freedom often creates tension, especially when those in charge abuse their authority. Perhaps you've experienced something similar: a neighbor who took rules too far, or an HOA that seemed to exist only to make your life difficult. What would you have done In Lucas's situation, would you have fought back or simply moved elsewhere? Your experiences matter, and they remind us that standing up against injustice, however small it seems, is always worth the effort. Share your thoughts below